No one really knows when memory began, only that one day the earth started speaking back. Somewhere between the silence of the rivers and the heat of the plain, hands pressed signs into wet clay. When they dried, those markings refused to fade. Thousands of years later, we call them Sumerian tablets. But to the people who made them, perhaps they were not records at all. Perhaps they were an attempt to trap something that was already slipping away. You've served your country. You've seen classified briefings, operational reports that never made it to the evening news. You understand how information flows, and more importantly, how it's controlled. What you're about to read will feel familiar in that regard. The same institutional resistance, the same careful omissions, the same pattern of careers derailed for asking the wrong questions. But this time, the cover-up reaches back 5,000 years. The morning sun cuts through the Venetian blinds of a converted garage outside Fort Bragg, casting geometric shadows across tables laden with photographs, tablets, fragments, and translation notes. Dr. Garrett Ashford adjusts his reading glasses, the same prescription safety glasses he'd worn during 27 years with the Army Corps of Engineers. Back then, he'd read blueprints and geological surveys. Now he reads cuneiform wedges that tell stories the Pentagon would prefer remained buried. His weathered hands, still steady despite 62 years and 3 combat tours, trace the edge of Fragment 7 Thanor 432b from the British Museum's basement archives. The clay tablet before him contains what appears to be a technical manual, not the religious poetry or administrative records that fill most Sumerian collections, but step-by-step instructions for something the academic world has spent decades explaining away. The cuneiform wedges, when properly translated, describe genetic modification procedures with a precision that would make a modern biochemist uncomfortable. Clay mixed with the essence of the sky dwellers, reads one line that took Ashford 6 months to decode. 7 vessels prepared according to the pattern of the double helix. Another passage details the activation of dormant codes within the blood of the earthborn. The establishment calls it mythology. Ashford calls it a field manual. His wife, Colonel Patricia Ashford, retired, emerges from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee. Black, the way they've both drunk it since basic training 38 years ago. 23 years in military intelligence left her with an instinct for recognizing when information doesn't add up, and the pattern emerging from their research has every alarm bell in her analytical mind ringing at full volume. The carbon dating came back on the Kish fragments, she says, setting his coffee on the only clear space among the research materials. Her voice carries the neutral tone she'd learned during interrogation training. No emotion that might telegraph her thoughts to hostile listeners. And? Ashford asks, though he already knows the answer will complicate everything. 3800 BCE, pre-dynastic, before writing was supposed to exist in any sophisticated form. She settles into the folding chair beside his makeshift desk, her movements economical and precise. But look at the organizational structure in these texts: sequential protocols, cross-referenced procedures, quality control measures. This reads like a technical operations manual. Garrett nods, his engineer's mind automatically categorizing the information. In 3 decades of military service, he'd learned to distinguish between coincidence and pattern. What he'd found in these ancient tablets displayed the systematic organization of a coordinated operation, not the random mythology of primitive storytellers. The Ashfords are not conspiracy theorists. They're analysts who've learned to trust evidence over explanations, patterns over press releases. And the pattern emerging from their research suggests that humanity's origin story contains operational details that certain institutions would prefer to keep classified at the highest levels. Patricia opens a file folder marked Classification Level Charlie, a designation that doesn't officially exist but appears consistently in their source materials. Inside are photographs of tablets that mainstream archaeology claims don't exist, fragments describing what can only be interpreted as breeding protocols for human populations. "Look at this sequence," she says, pointing to a series of photographs showing cuneiform text from multiple sources. The terminology is consistent across sites separated by hundreds of miles and spanning 3 centuries. Same technical vocabulary, same procedural structure, same administrative framework. Garrett examines the images through his magnifying glass, his eyes tracking the wedge-shaped marks that had once been pressed into wet clay by hands that understood things modern science was only beginning to rediscover. The precision of the language struck him immediately, not the flowery metaphors of religious texts, but the clinical terminology of operational documentation. "Personnel assignments," he murmurs, recognizing organizational patterns from his own military experience. "Duty rosters, chain of command. Someone was running a coordinated operation across multiple installations using standardized procedures and unified command structure." They say civilization began in Sumer, where the Tigris and Euphrates bend like the ribs of a sleeping animal. Yet the first stories carved into clay did not begin with men, but with kings who were not entirely human. The Sumerian king list names rulers who reigned for periods that stretch credibility. Alulim, who ruled Eridu for 28 centuries, Alalgar for 36 centuries, 8 kings before the flood, their reigns stretching across 28,000 years of continuous governance. These numbers had troubled Ashford when he first encountered them. As an engineer, he understood the difference between symbolic representation and literal documentation. The king list displayed the systematic precision of administrative records, not the poetic exaggeration of mythological narrative. Patricia spreads additional photographs across the table, fragments from sites across Mesopotamia showing consistent references to these extended reigns. "If these are symbolic, where's the variation you'd expect from different cultural interpretations? Every site shows the same numbers, the same names, the same administrative structure." "Because they're not symbolic," Garrett replies, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of an engineer who'd spent decades reading specifications. "They're documentation, personnel files for a management structure that operated for millennia before the system reset." The implications hung in the morning air like smoke from a distant fire. If the king list represented actual administrative records rather than mythological narrative, then human civilization had operated under the direct management of beings whose capabilities exceeded anything in the contemporary historical record. Patricia closes the file folder and meets her husband's eyes. In 23 years of intelligence work, she'd learned to recognize when evidence pointed toward conclusions that powerful institutions would find unacceptable. The pattern emerging from their research fell squarely into that category. "We need to talk to Hawthorne," she says quietly. "If we're right about this, we're going to need all the academic credibility we can gather before the suppression protocols kick in." Outside, the North Carolina morning continues its ordinary progression toward noon. Birds calling from pine trees that had been seedlings when both Ashfords were learning to march in formation. But inside their converted garage laboratory, 2 military veterans contemplate evidence that suggests human history contains operational details that certain institutions have spent considerable resources to keep buried. Professor Stanley Hawthorne's office at the University of Pennsylvania resembles a war room more than an academic workspace. Filing cabinets line 3 walls, each drawer labeled with dates spanning 4 decades of research. Maps of Mesopotamian archaeological sites cover the remaining wall space, marked with colored pins that indicate sites where significant discoveries have been made, and subsequently classified beyond public access. At 71, Hawthorne carries himself with the deliberate precision of a man who's spent 43 years fighting institutional resistance to uncomfortable truths. His gray beard, meticulously trimmed, frames a face weathered by decades of archaeological fieldwork under Middle Eastern sun. But it's his eyes that reveal the cost of his research, the steady gaze of someone who's seen evidence that contradicts everything he was taught to believe about human civilization. The call from Patricia Ashford reaches him during his Wednesday morning office hours, a time when graduate students typically seek guidance on thesis projects they'll never be allowed to complete if they ask the right questions. Her voice carries the crisp authority of military intelligence, and her request for a secure meeting location tells him immediately that the Ashfords have discovered something significant. Building 47, room 312, Hawthorne responds, providing coordinates for a conference room in the university's rarely used administrative annex. 1400 hours. Come prepared for a lengthy discussion. 2 hours later, Hawthorne reviews his files while waiting for the Ashfords to arrive. The materials spread across the conference table represent decades of careful documentation. Photographs of artifacts that have disappeared from museum collections, translation notes for tablets that official academia claims don't exist, and correspondence with colleagues whose careers ended abruptly after publishing inconvenient discoveries. The sound of military-precise footsteps in the hallway announces the Ashfords' arrival before they knock. Hawthorne opens the door to find exactly what he expected. 2 veterans whose posture and bearing identify them as career military, despite civilian clothes. Garrett Ashford's handshake confirms 30 years of physical labor and weapons handling. Patricia's eye movement as she surveys the room reveals intelligence training that never fully deactivates. "Professor?" Garrett begins, settling into a chair with the careful movement of someone whose joints remember combat injuries. "We've been analyzing Sumerian administrative texts, and we're finding organizational patterns that don't match accepted historical timelines." Hawthorne nods, recognizing the careful language of people who understand operational security. "Show me what you found." Patricia opens a briefcase that reveals the systematic organization of a professional intelligence analyst. Photographs, translation notes, and comparison charts are arranged in logical sequence, each document protected by clear plastic sleeves marked with classification designations that don't appear in any public system. Fragment analysis from multiple sites shows consistent terminology across geographical and temporal boundaries, Patricia explains, spreading the materials across the table. Same administrative vocabulary, same procedural structure, same command hierarchy. Either we're looking at remarkable cultural consistency, or we're looking at centralized management. Hawthorne examines the photographs through a magnifying glass, his academic training immediately recognizing the significance of what the Ashfords have documented. The cuneiform texts display organizational complexity that exceeded anything attributed to early Mesopotamian civilization in mainstream archaeological interpretation. The King List presents the biggest challenge to conventional timelines, Garrett continues, pointing to a series of tablets showing consistent numerical references. Rulers governing for periods measured in centuries rather than decades. Administrative continuity spanning millennia. Population management protocols that reference genetic modification procedures. The phrase genetic modification hangs in the conference room air like cordite after weapons fire. Hawthorne has spent decades approaching the same conclusion through different analytical pathways, but hearing it spoken aloud by serious researchers carries emotional impact that purely academic speculation cannot match. "I've been tracking similar patterns for 4 decades, Hawthorne responds, opening his own files to reveal documentation that mirrors the Ashfords' discoveries. Systematic suppression of archaeological evidence, career destruction for researchers who publish inconvenient findings, and institutional coordination that suggests policy rather than coincidence. He spreads additional photographs across the table. Fragments from Nineveh, Babylon, and Ur, showing consistent references to beings described as sky dwellers who implemented breeding protocols for human populations. The terminology displays clinical precision that contrasts sharply with the poetic language typically found in religious texts. Look at this sequence from the Atrahasis epic, Hawthorne says, pointing to a series of cuneiform lines. Standard translation interprets this as mythological narrative about divine creation. But read literally, it's describing systematic genetic modification using specific technical procedures. Patricia studies the text through her own magnifying glass, her intelligence background allowing her to recognize operational documentation regardless of language or historical period. Population control measures, she murmurs. Quality assurance protocols, performance monitoring. This reads like a management manual. Because that's exactly what it is, Hawthorne replies. Administrative documentation for a coordinated operation spanning multiple sites and extended timeframes. The mythology interpretation serves institutional needs by transforming literal historical records into metaphorical narratives that can be safely dismissed. Garrett examines additional fragments showing references to vessel preparation and essence mixing in language that suggests laboratory procedures rather than religious ritual. His engineering background allows him to recognize technical specifications despite the archaic terminology. Someone was running systematic breeding programs, he says quietly. Multi-generational genetic modification with specific performance objectives. The administrative structure required to coordinate such operations would have exceeded anything in the contemporary historical record. Hawthorne nods gravely. Which explains why mainstream archaeology cannot acknowledge these findings without destabilizing fundamental assumptions about human development. The implications threaten established paradigms in multiple academic disciplines. The three researchers sit in contemplative silence, each processing evidence that confirms conclusions they'd reached through independent analysis. The magnitude of what they'd discovered carries professional consequences that extend far beyond academic disagreement. We need to discuss operational security, Patricia says, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd managed classified information throughout her career. If our analysis is correct, there are institutional interests with significant motivation to suppress these findings. Hawthorne opens a thick folder marked with dates spanning the previous 2 decades. Inside are newspaper clippings, academic journals, and personal correspondence documenting the systematic career destruction of researchers who'd approached similar conclusions. Dr. Michael Harrison, University of Chicago, published preliminary findings about genetic anomalies in Mesopotamian burial sites in 2003, lost tenure the following year due to budget constraints. Hawthorne's voice carries the flat neutrality of someone reading casualty reports. Professor Sarah Mitchell, Oxford, presented evidence of technological anachronisms in Sumerian artifacts in 2007. Research funding disappeared, followed by professional ostracization. The pattern repeats across pages of documentation. Researchers whose careers ended abruptly after publishing evidence that contradicted accepted historical narratives. The consistency suggests coordinated response rather than random academic politics. We're not dealing with scholarly disagreement, Patricia observes, her intelligence training recognizing the operational signatures of information warfare. Someone is implementing active suppression protocols using institutional mechanisms. Outside the conference room windows, late afternoon shadows stretch across the university campus, where students pursue education in disciplines whose fundamental assumptions may be based on carefully constructed deceptions. Inside room 312, 3 researchers contemplate evidence that suggests human civilization contains operational secrets that powerful institutions consider too dangerous for public knowledge. Agent Claire Morrison adjusts the volume on her surveillance equipment as the conversation in University Building 47, Room 312, reaches operational significance. Through directional microphones positioned in adjacent offices, she monitors the meeting between the Ashfords and Professor Hawthorne with the professional detachment of someone who spent 8 years managing information security for Blackstone Archaeological Consulting. At 34, Morrison represents the new generation of corporate security specialists, former military intelligence personnel who've transitioned, to private sector operations that exist in the gray zone between legitimate business and classified government programs. Her background includes 4 years with Army Signals Intelligence, followed by specialized training in archaeological site security and academic surveillance protocols. The briefing materials in her tactical case outline the threat assessment that brought her to Philadelphia. Dr. Garrett Ashford and Colonel Patricia Ashford have been flagged as persons of interest due to their research into Mesopotamian artifacts displaying technological anachronisms. Professor Stanley Hawthorne has been under intermittent surveillance since 1987, when his initial publications about Sumerian administrative texts began approaching classified territory. Morrison's earpiece crackles with the voice of her operations coordinator, speaking from Blackstone's Virginia headquarters. Asset positioning confirmed. Academic target shows signs of correlation with military targets. Recommend elevation to Level Charlie protocols. She acknowledges with a double click of her transmitter, her attention returning to the conversation filtering through her surveillance equipment. The researchers are discussing translation methodologies for cuneiform texts that shouldn't exist in any accessible archaeological collection. Their level of detail suggests access to materials that Blackstone's institutional partners have spent considerable resources to suppress. The classification system governing Morrison's operations follows a simple hierarchy. Level Alpha materials are released to academic journals after appropriate editing to remove sensitive implications. Level Bravo discoveries are archived indefinitely under the designation "requires further study." Level Charlie findings disappear entirely, along with any researchers who persist in investigating them. The Ashford research clearly falls into Level Charlie territory. Morrison reviews her operational parameters while monitoring the ongoing conversation. Her assignment involves what corporate manuals euphemistically call soft containment, disrupting research through administrative interference rather than direct confrontation. Academic institutions cooperate readily with such efforts, understanding that controversial research threatens their funding relationships with government and corporate sponsors. The methodology has proven effective across multiple decades. Researchers who challenge established paradigms find their grant applications rejected, their papers excluded from peer review, and their access to archaeological materials permanently restricted. Career destruction follows naturally from bureaucratic pressure, requiring no dramatic intervention that might generate unwanted attention. Through her earpiece, Morrison hears Professor Hawthorne discussing a folder of documentation that chronicles similar career terminations spanning 20 years. The systematic nature of these academic casualties confirms the effectiveness of current suppression protocols, but also indicates that the information being suppressed continues surfacing despite institutional countermeasures. Dr. Patricia Fleming, Harvard University. Hawthorne's voice continues through the surveillance feed. Published genetic analysis of Mesopotamian burial sites showing chromosomal anomalies inconsistent with accepted evolutionary timelines. Lost tenure in 2009 following accusations of research falsification that were never formally substantiated. Morrison makes notes on her tactical pad, recognizing Fleming's name from previous Blackstone operations. The Harvard researcher had been particularly persistent, requiring multiple intervention cycles before her academic credibility was sufficiently damaged to ensure permanent marginalization. Professor James Baldwin, University of Michigan, presented evidence of precision engineering in Sumerian architectural sites that exceeded contemporary technological capabilities. Research funding terminated in 2011, followed by departmental restructuring that eliminated his position. The pattern Hawthorne describes represents successful implementation of institutional control mechanisms that have protected sensitive information for decades. Each terminated career demonstrates the effectiveness of coordinated response to paradigm-threatening research, but the continued emergence of new researchers suggests that complete suppression may require additional measures. Morrison's operational briefing includes psychological profiles of the current targets. Military veterans demonstrate higher resistance to institutional pressure than traditional academics, their training emphasizing evidence-based analysis over consensus building. Their credibility with certain demographic segments makes them particularly dangerous to established narratives about human development. The Ashfords represent a specific threat category due to their combined military background and analytical capabilities. Their research methodology emphasizes operational implications rather than theoretical speculation, approaching archaeological evidence with the same systematic analysis they'd applied to classified military intelligence throughout their careers. Through her surveillance equipment, Morrison hears Dr. Ashford discussing carbon dating results that confirm the authenticity of tablets containing genetic modification protocols. His engineering background allows him to recognize technical specifications regardless of their archaic presentation, while his wife's intelligence training enables pattern recognition that transcends cultural and temporal boundaries. Fragment analysis shows consistent administrative terminology across multiple sites. Patricia Ashford's voice continues through the surveillance feed. Same procedural structure, same command hierarchy, same quality control measures. Either we're looking at remarkable cultural uniformity, or we're looking at centralized management. The phrase centralized management triggers automatic recording protocols in Morrison's equipment. Such terminology approaches operational classifications that require immediate escalation to senior Blackstone personnel with direct government liaison responsibilities. Morrison activates her secure communication system to contact headquarters. The encrypted channel connects directly to her operations coordinator, bypassing normal corporate hierarchy to reach personnel with appropriate security clearances for sensitive archaeological matters. Asset reporting level Charlie indicators she transmits using standardized code phrases. Academic targets demonstrate correlation with military targets, recommend immediate implementation of enhanced containment protocols. The response comes within minutes, confirming authorization for expanded surveillance and preparation of active countermeasures. Morrison's operational authority now includes monitoring all communications by the target researchers, financial investigation to identify vulnerability points, and coordination with academic institutions to implement professional isolation procedures. Her tactical case contains additional equipment for extended surveillance operations, advanced audio monitoring systems, communication interception capabilities, and documentation tools for building comprehensive profiles of target research activities. The technology represents military-grade surveillance adapted for academic environments where traditional intelligence gathering requires subtle methodology. Morrison positions additional monitoring devices while the researchers continue their discussion of Sumerian administrative texts. Their conversation reveals access to archaeological materials that should be restricted under current classification protocols, suggesting either security breaches in institutional archives or unauthorized translation of suppressed documents. The implications concern Morrison's superiors enough to authorize what operational manuals describe as comprehensive academic intervention. Such measures involve coordinated pressure across multiple institutions to ensure complete isolation of target researchers from resources, colleagues, and publication venues. Professor Hawthorne's 4 decades of research make him a particular priority for neutralization. His institutional knowledge and academic credibility could legitimize conclusions that civilian authorities successfully marginalize when proposed by less credentialed researchers. The systematic destruction of his career would send appropriate messages to other academics contemplating similar research directions. As afternoon shadows lengthen across the University of Pennsylvania campus, Morrison prepares for extended surveillance operations that may require weeks or months to achieve complete containment. The research being discussed in Room 312 threatens fundamental assumptions about human development that powerful institutions consider essential to maintain. Through her surveillance equipment, she continues monitoring a conversation that confirms her operational briefings were accurate. The Ashfords and Professor Hawthorne have independently reached conclusions that, if publicized, would require comprehensive damage control across multiple academic disciplines and government agencies. Morrison's assignment represents the intersection of corporate security and institutional preservation, protecting carefully constructed historical narratives from evidence that might destabilize established paradigms. The work requires patience, precision, and absolute commitment to operational objectives that transcend individual academic careers or personal consequences. Outside the university windows, students pursue education in disciplines whose foundational assumptions depend on the continued suppression of archaeological evidence discovered decades earlier. Inside Morrison's surveillance post, advanced monitoring equipment records conversations that document humanity's true origins, conversations that will never reach public awareness if current containment protocols achieve their intended objectives. The tablets speak of beings they called the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. Traditional scholarship interprets this as religious symbolism, gods descending from celestial realms to rule primitive humans. But when Professor Hawthorne strips away the mythological language and focuses on operational details, a different picture emerges from the cuneiform wedges pressed into clay 4,000 years ago. Back in his private office, Hawthorne spreads the most sensitive materials across his desk, photographs and translations that exist in no official archaeological database. The tablets describe the Anunnaki arriving in organized groups, each with specific technical specializations that read more like military unit designations than divine attributes. Enki, designated as Lord of the Abzu, managed what the texts clearly identify as genetic laboratories in underground facilities. The Sumerian word Abzu translates literally as deep water, but contextual analysis suggests it referenced subterranean installations rather than mythological realms. Enlil controlled atmospheric operations and weather modification protocols, terminology that would be familiar to any meteorologist or atmospheric scientist. Ninhursag oversaw bioform development and quality assurance, language that mirrors contemporary biotechnology industry standards. These weren't gods in any traditional religious sense. They were department heads managing a coordinated research and development operation. The tablets describe their work with clinical precision that contrasts sharply with the poetic language typically found in religious texts. Humans were designed as worker units, biological machines capable of complex tasks, but genetically limited to prevent rebellion. The process involved extracting genetic material from existing hominid populations and introducing what the texts call sky-dweller essence to create enhanced but controllable beings. Hawthorne's translation notes reveal the systematic nature of this genetic modification program. Early prototypes failed according to specific criteria. The tablets reference multiple production runs, each attempting to correct flaws identified in previous models. Too aggressive, and the units became unmanageable. Too passive, and they couldn't perform assigned functions. The optimal design required careful calibration, intelligent enough for complex labor, limited enough for long-term stability. Modern genetics has identified several puzzling features in human DNA that align uncomfortably with these ancient descriptions. Approximately 8% of human genetic material consists of endogenous retroviruses, viral sequences integrated into our chromosomes that serve no apparent biological function. These insertions occurred too systematically across human populations to result from random infection. The pattern suggests deliberate modification rather than natural evolution. Dr. Ashford's research includes classified Department of Defense reports studying DNA samples extracted from ancient Mesopotamian burial sites. The military's interest in such materials officially focuses on biological warfare agent identification, but the actual research parameters reveal different priorities. Genetic analysis consistently shows anomalies that shouldn't exist in populations dated to 3000 BCE. Haplogroups with no known ancestry appear suddenly in the archaeological record. Chromosomal modifications that required sophisticated biotechnology emerge without precursor development. Most significantly, these genetic changes occurred simultaneously across wide geographical areas, suggesting coordinated implementation rather than gradual evolution. Someone was editing the human genome 4,000 years ago, Ashford explains to his wife as they review the latest military laboratory results. Not random mutation, systematic modification with specific performance objectives. Colonel Ashford recognizes the operational signatures from her intelligence background. Rapid technological advancement followed by simultaneous deployment across multiple theaters indicates central planning with distributed implementation. Coordinated rollout, she confirms. Military-style logistics with unified command structure. The flood event described in Sumerian texts represents a critical inflection point in this development program. The tablets describe it not as divine punishment for human wickedness, but as population reset following containment failure. The enhanced humans had become too successful, too numerous, too capable of independent thought that threatened operational control. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation more than religious mythology. Flood layers in Mesopotamian excavation sites show sudden demographic transitions that coincide with the Sumerian timeline. Pre-flood populations display one set of genetic markers. Post-flood populations show entirely different ones. The transition suggests species replacement rather than natural disaster survival. The survivors carried specific genetic modifications designed to prevent future containment failures. Shortened lifespans to limit individual accumulation of knowledge and experience. Enhanced susceptibility to authority figures through neurological architecture that favored tribal loyalty over independent analysis. Most importantly, accelerated forgetting mechanisms that prevented long-term memory retention across generations. Professor Hawthorne's files contain correspondence from researchers worldwide reporting similar findings. Geneticists in Beijing identifying impossible mutation rates in ancient DNA samples. Archaeologists in Peru documenting construction techniques that exceed modern engineering capabilities. Anthropologists in Egypt studying elongated skulls with cranial volumes 15% larger than contemporary humans. The pattern spans continents and cultures, suggesting global rather than regional intervention. Agent Morrison's surveillance equipment records these discussions with growing concern for her operational objectives. The researchers have independently reached conclusions that align with classified government studies conducted over multiple decades. Their military backgrounds provide analytical frameworks that traditional academics lack enabling them to recognize operational patterns that trained specialists deliberately obscure. The Sumerian tablets describe the withdrawal phase following successful population modification. Having established sustainable control systems, the Anunnaki returned to their heavenly realm, leaving behind hybrid ruling classes to maintain social order. These bloodlines carried enough divine essence to command authority while lacking capabilities to threaten their creators. Over subsequent generations, even this diluted inheritance faded. The god-kings of early Sumer gave way to merely human rulers who maintained power through increasingly elaborate religious and political systems. The direct genetic connection to the original modification program became legend, then myth, then forgotten history preserved only in clay tablets that few could read and fewer dared interpret literally. But the control systems remained embedded in human civilization. Hierarchical social structures that channeled human behavior into predictable patterns. Reverence for authority that transcended rational analysis. Suspicion of independent thought that prevented dangerous accumulation of knowledge. These weren't natural evolutionary developments. They were engineered features designed to prevent another containment failure that might require additional population reset. Operations. Dr. Ashford's latest analysis focuses on linguistic evidence that traditional scholarship has never adequately explained. The Sumerian language appears suddenly in the archaeological record with no evolutionary precursors, unlike other ancient languages that developed gradually from simpler communication systems. Sumerian emerges as a complete, sophisticated linguistic framework with complex grammar and extensive technical vocabulary that suggests institutional design rather than organic cultural development. It's not a naturally evolved language, he explains to Colonel Ashford as they review comparative linguistic studies spread across their garage laboratory. It's an imposed administrative standard, like establishing English as the operational language for NATO forces, unified communication protocol for management efficiency. The tablets describe this linguistic standardization as part of post-flood reorganization procedures. Previous human populations had developed multiple communication systems that interfered with administrative coordination across geographical regions. The solution involved implementing a single standardized language designed for clarity and compliance rather than cultural expression or artistic development. Sumerian cuneiform writing demonstrates similar characteristics of institutional implementation. The symbols appear suddenly in the archaeological record, fully formed, with no transitional period between primitive pictographic representation and sophisticated abstract character systems. The organizational principles embedded in cuneiform, standardized symbols, systematic grammar structures, efficient information storage methodologies, suggest deliberate design by administrators familiar with large-scale communication requirements. Professor Hawthorne's research includes examples of training tablets discovered at various Mesopotamian archaeological sites. These fragments contain repetitive linguistic exercises, phonetic drills, vocabulary lists, grammatical structure practice that read exactly like instruction manuals for non-native speakers learning an imposed language system. The clay preserves evidence of systematic linguistic conversion programs implemented across wide geographical areas using standardized curriculum materials. Look at these practice sequences, Hawthorne points out during their secure meeting, indicating photographs of tablets showing identical exercise patterns from sites hundreds of miles apart. Same lesson structure, same vocabulary progression, same grammatical exercises. Someone was running coordinated language training programs using unified instructional materials. The implications prove profound for understanding post-flood human development. If Sumerian was artificially imposed rather than naturally evolved, It suggests that surviving human populations underwent comprehensive cultural reprogramming designed to facilitate administrative control. Language shapes thought patterns. Controlling communication means controlling consciousness itself at fundamental neurological levels. Agent Morrison's surveillance reports document the researchers' growing understanding of these linguistic control mechanisms. Her operational briefing materials include psychological assessments indicating that military veterans demonstrate particular resistance to such revelations due to their familiarity with information warfare techniques and institutional manipulation strategies. The Ashfords represent a specific threat category because their combined backgrounds enable them to recognize operational patterns that civilian academics typically miss or dismiss. Their analytical methodology emphasizes evidence-based conclusions over consensus-building approaches that characterize traditional scholarly research within institutional frameworks. Morrison's assignment involves implementing what corporate security manuals classify as comprehensive academic intervention, disrupting research through coordinated institutional pressure rather than direct confrontation that might generate unwanted public attention. Universities cooperate readily with such efforts, understanding that controversial research threatens their funding relationships with government agencies and corporate sponsors. The linguistic evidence extends beyond Sumerian language structure to include acoustic properties that suggest additional layers of consciousness manipulation. When properly pronounced using reconstructed phonetic values, Sumerian produces resonant frequencies that align with brainwave patterns associated with enhanced suggestibility and reduced critical thinking capacity. Dr. Ashford's engineering background enables him to recognize these acoustic characteristics as potentially deliberate rather than coincidental. The vowel sequences create harmonic intervals that affect neurological function, he explains to his wife while reviewing spectrographic analysis of reconstructed Sumerian pronunciation. Specific frequency combinations that influence brain chemistry and cognitive processing. Modern neuroscience has identified similar effects in various cultural practices: Tibetan chanting, Gregorian hymns, Islamic prayer recitation. All utilize sound frequencies that produce measurable changes in brain activity. The Sumerian language appears designed to incorporate such neurological manipulation into ordinary communication, creating subtle but persistent influence on populations using the language for daily interaction. Colonel Ashford recognizes the operational implications immediately. Embedded influence mechanism, she observes, her intelligence training allowing her to categorize the technique within established frameworks for population control. Continuous low-level conditioning through normal social interaction. Professor Hawthorne's files contain additional evidence supporting this interpretation. Archaeological sites throughout Mesopotamia show consistent architectural features designed to amplify acoustic properties, chambers with specific dimensional ratios that enhance resonance, surface materials that reflect sound at calculated angles, and positioning that maximizes acoustic effect during group gatherings. Temple complexes weren't just religious centers, Hawthorne explains, indicating architectural diagrams that reveal sophisticated acoustic engineering. They were acoustic manipulation facilities designed to amplify the neurological effects of Sumerian language pronunciation during group activities. The systematic nature of these installations suggests coordinated implementation of consciousness manipulation technology disguised as religious architecture. Each temple complex followed standardized design principles that optimized acoustic properties while maintaining the appearance of spiritual rather than technological infrastructure. Agent Morrison's monitoring equipment records these discussions with increasing concern for her operational objectives. The researchers have identified control mechanisms that remain embedded in contemporary institutional structures, suggesting that ancient manipulation techniques continue operating through modern bureaucratic and technological systems. The revelation that language itself serves as a vector for consciousness, manipulation threatens to expose control mechanisms that depend on their invisibility to maintain effectiveness. If human populations understood how linguistic and acoustic manipulation influences their thought patterns, the techniques would lose their subtle but powerful influence on behavioral compliance. Morrison's operational parameters include preventing such revelations from reaching broader audiences through any available means. The implications of the researchers' discoveries extend far beyond academic disagreement into territory that threatens fundamental assumptions about human autonomy and institutional authority that modern civilization depends upon for stability and control. The Sumerian tablets provide detailed descriptions of the facilities used for genetic modification programs. Installations they called abzu that contained what modern translation reveals as sophisticated laboratory complexes. These underground structures featured vessels of transformation and chambers of essence mixing equipped with technology that the ancient scribes could only describe using available vocabulary from their agricultural society. Modern archaeology has identified massive subterranean structures at several key Mesopotamian sites, but official excavation reports systematically classify them as flood drainage systems or grain storage facilities. The bureaucratic language obscures architectural features that suggest far more sophisticated purposes than water management or food storage could possibly require. Satellite imagery from declassified military surveillance reveals geometric patterns beneath archaeological sites that indicate extensive underground construction. The formations display organizational principles, right angles, parallel corridors, centralized chambers that exceed anything documented in surface architecture from comparable historical periods. Ground-penetrating radar confirms the presence of large chambers connected by corridor systems that extend far deeper than official archaeological reports acknowledge. Dr. Ashford reviews these satellite images with the analytical skills developed during 27 years of military engineering projects. The underground structures display construction techniques that required capabilities beyond anything attributed to ancient Mesopotamian civilization in mainstream historical interpretation. "Look at these foundation patterns," he points out to his wife while examining high-resolution imagery of the Eridu site. Reinforced concrete-equivalent materials, precision-cut stone blocks weighing multiple tons, and load-bearing calculations that required advanced mathematics and engineering knowledge. Colonel Ashford recognizes the strategic implications immediately. Underground facilities of such scale and sophistication could only be constructed by organizations with resources comparable to modern military-industrial capabilities. The operational requirements, materials, logistics, workforce coordination, exceed anything possible for the agricultural societies that supposedly built them. Someone was operating industrial-scale construction projects while surface populations were still using primitive tools, she observes, her intelligence background enabling her to recognize the operational impossibility of official archaeological interpretations. Professor Hawthorne's research files contain documentation of systematic access restrictions at these underground sites. Archaeological permits for comprehensive excavation are consistently denied due to political instability, security concerns, or environmental protection requirements. The bureaucratic obstacles ensure that detailed investigation remains impossible despite obvious historical significance. Private military contractors maintain security perimeters around these locations, officially protecting them from looters and terrorist activities. In practice, the security measures ensure that any discoveries remain under institutional control rather than reaching independent researchers or public awareness through normal academic channels. Agent Morrison's operational briefing materials include site security protocols for 17 classified archaeological locations across Iraq, Syria, and southeastern Turkey. Each site shows evidence of extensive underground construction that predates accepted timelines for advanced engineering capabilities in the region. Security classifications range from Level Bravo to Level Charlie, indicating varying degrees of sensitivity regarding potential discoveries. For most sensitive installations require presidential-level authorization for access, suggesting that previous excavations have produced findings with implications for national security. Morrison's clearance level provides access to preliminary reports, indicating the discovery of technological artifacts that cannot be explained using conventional archaeological interpretation. Metallurgical samples showing impossible alloy compositions for their era, one report notes with clinical precision. Precision-machined components requiring industrial manufacturing capabilities, electronic devices of unknown function displaying operational characteristics after 4 millennia of burial. Such discoveries cannot be acknowledged without destabilizing fundamental assumptions about technological development that underpin modern scientific paradigms. The solution involves classification protocols that remove sensitive materials from academic scrutiny while maintaining public confidence in established historical narratives. The systematic nature of this suppression extends beyond individual site security to include coordination among multiple institutions. Museums, universities, and government agencies cooperate to ensure that inconvenient discoveries disappear into restricted archives rather than reaching researchers capable of recognizing their significance. Professor Hawthorne has documented this institutional coordination through 43 years of careful observation. Artifacts that contradict accepted timelines are quietly reclassified or transferred to secure storage facilities that few scholars can access. Researchers who persist in investigating sensitive materials find their academic credentials questioned, their funding terminated, and their professional reputations systematically destroyed. Dr. William Patterson, University of California, discovered precision-cut granite blocks at Babylon showing tool marks inconsistent with Bronze Age technology. Hawthorne reads from his files of terminated academic careers. Lost tenure in 2013 following accusations of research fraud that were never formally substantiated but effectively ended his career. The pattern repeats across decades of documentation. Researchers whose discoveries threatened established paradigms facing systematic career destruction through institutional pressure. The consistency suggests coordinated policy rather than random academic politics or personal conflicts between colleagues. Agent Morrison's assignment represents the intersection of corporate security and institutional preservation, protecting carefully constructed historical narratives from evidence that might destabilize established academic and political authority structures. Her role involves monitoring researchers who approach sensitive conclusions and implementing appropriate countermeasures to prevent public dissemination of classified information. The underground facilities described in Sumerian tablets may represent physical infrastructure for genetic modification programs that continued operating far longer than mainstream history acknowledges. If such installations contained technological capabilities comparable to modern biotechnology, their discovery would require comprehensive revision of assumptions about human development and technological progression. Morrison's operational parameters include preventing such revelations from reaching broader audiences through any available means. The implications extend beyond academic disagreement into territory that threatens fundamental assumptions about human progress and institutional authority that modern civilization depends upon for social stability. The Sumerian texts describe these underground complexes as remaining operational for centuries after the surface withdrawal of the Anunnaki administrative personnel. Local populations continued maintaining the facilities under direction of hybrid ruling classes until gradual technological degradation made continued operation impossible. Archaeological evidence suggests that some installations were deliberately sealed rather than abandoned, with entrance passages filled using sophisticated engineering techniques designed to prevent future access. The effort required to accomplish such comprehensive sealing indicates that the contents were considered too dangerous for discovery by subsequent civilizations. The genetic evidence emerges from laboratories that officially study ancient DNA for historical population analysis, but whose classified research parameters reveal different priorities entirely. Dr. Ashford's military contacts provide access to Department of Defense studies that examine chromosomal material extracted from Mesopotamian burial sites dating to 3000 BCE. The results consistently show genetic anomalies that challenge fundamental assumptions about human evolutionary development. Haplogroups appear suddenly in the archaeological record, without ancestral populations to explain their origin. Chromosomal modifications requiring sophisticated biotechnology emerge fully formed, with no evidence of gradual development through natural selection processes. These aren't random mutations, Dr. Ashford explains to his wife while reviewing the latest classified laboratory reports. The genetic modifications show systematic patterns, specific genes enhanced, others suppressed, new sequences inserted at precise locations. Someone was editing human chromosomes with technology we're only beginning to understand. Colonel Ashford studies the data with her intelligence analyst's training in pattern recognition. The genetic changes occurred simultaneously across wide geographical areas, indicating coordinated implementation rather than gradual evolution through environmental pressure. Centralized program, she confirms. Unified technical standards applied across multiple populations. Modern geneticists have identified approximately 8% of human DNA consisting of endogenous retroviruses, viral sequences integrated into our chromosomes that serve no apparent biological function. The insertion patterns show systematic organization rather than random viral infection, suggesting deliberate modification using retroviral vectors as delivery mechanisms for genetic programming. Professor Hawthorne's research includes correspondence with molecular biologists who've discovered similar anomalies in populations worldwide. The genetic modifications appear in human populations that had no historical contact, yet show identical chromosomal changes occurring within the same time period. The global scope indicates technological capabilities that exceeded anything available to ancient civilizations, according to conventional historical interpretation. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, MIT Genetics Department, Hawthorne reads from his files of suppressed research. Published preliminary findings about systematic genetic modifications in ancient European populations. Research funding disappeared in 2014, followed by transfer to a corporate laboratory where her work became classified. The pattern of academic suppression extends to genetic research that approaches conclusions about deliberate human modification. Researchers who publish findings about ancient genetic anomalies find their careers terminated through institutional pressure that prevents further investigation of sensitive materials. Agent Morrison's surveillance equipment records these discussions with growing concern about operational security. The researchers have accessed classified genetic data that should be restricted to personnel with appropriate security clearances and need-to-know authorization. Their military backgrounds provide analytical frameworks that enable them to recognize patterns that civilian academics lack training to interpret. The genetic modifications identified in ancient populations include enhanced cognitive capacity, extended lifespan potential, and neurological architecture optimized for specific behavioral characteristics. Post-flood populations show different modifications: reduced cognitive capacity, shortened lifespans, and enhanced susceptibility to authority figures through neurological changes that favor compliance over independent analysis. They were breeding two different versions, Dr. Ashford observes, while comparing pre-flood and post-flood genetic samples. Enhanced models for administrative personnel, reduced models for general population. Quality control through genetic engineering. The implications prove profound for understanding contemporary human behavior patterns. If post-flood genetic modifications included neurological changes that enhanced compliance and reduced independent thinking, such characteristics would have been passed down through subsequent generations, influencing human behavior for millennia after the original modification programs ended. Colonel Ashford recognizes the operational significance immediately. Embedded control mechanisms, she explains, using intelligence terminology, behavioral programming integrated into the genome itself, self-perpetuating influence that operates below conscious awareness. Modern populations may carry genetic programming designed to maintain social control systems established 4,000 years ago. The modifications would explain persistent human behaviors that seem counterproductive from survival perspectives: automatic deference to authority, resistance to paradigm-changing information, and preference for familiar narratives over uncomfortable truths. Professor Hawthorne's files document the systematic suppression of research that approaches such conclusions. Genetic studies that reveal ancient human modifications are classified under national security provisions that prevent academic publication or peer review. The institutional response suggests that confirming deliberate genetic manipulation of human populations poses threats to social stability that government agencies consider unacceptable. Agent Morrison's operational briefing materials include psychological assessments indicating that military veterans demonstrate higher resistance to embedded genetic programming due to training that emphasizes independent analysis and evidence-based decision-making. Their analytical capabilities make them particularly dangerous to established narratives that depend on population compliance for institutional stability. The Ashfords represent a specific threat category because their combined military backgrounds enable them to recognize operational patterns, while their genetic research confirms the biological mechanisms that maintain social control. Their credibility with veteran demographics could legitimize conclusions that threaten fundamental assumptions about human autonomy and institutional authority. Morrison's assignment involves preventing such revelations from reaching broader audiences through comprehensive academic intervention protocols. The genetic evidence documented by the researchers could destabilize social control mechanisms that have operated successfully for millennia, requiring immediate containment to preserve institutional stability. The Sumerian tablets describe the genetic modifications as temporary measures designed to prevent population uprising during the transition period following the flood reset. However, the programming proved so effective at maintaining social order that it was incorporated into permanent human genetic architecture, rather than being removed after the crisis period ended. Contemporary human behavior patterns continue reflecting this ancient genetic programming through unconscious compliance with authority structures, resistance to paradigm-threatening information, and preference for institutional narratives over independent analysis. The modifications operate below conscious awareness, making them nearly impossible to overcome through willpower or education alone. Dr. Ashford's research suggests that only individuals with specific genetic variants, possibly remnants of the original enhanced modifications, demonstrate significant resistance to embedded behavioral programming. Such individuals appear disproportionately in military, law enforcement, and independent research communities where analytical thinking receives institutional support. The genetic evidence confirms what the Sumerian tablets document through administrative records. Humanity underwent systematic modification designed to ensure long-term social control through biological rather than technological means. The program succeeded beyond its designers' expectations, creating behavioral compliance that persists across countless generations without requiring active maintenance or enforcement. The confrontation begins subtly, as such operations always do in the modern era. Dr. Ashford discovers it first when his university library access card stops working during a routine research session. The automated system displays a terse message: "Account suspended pending administrative review." When he calls the library's information desk, the staff member claims no knowledge of any suspension and promises to investigate. A promise that yields no follow-up contact despite repeated inquiries. Colonel Ashford recognizes the operational signature immediately. During 23 years in military intelligence, she'd implemented similar tactics against foreign research teams whose investigations approached classified territory. The methodology involves systematic degradation of target capabilities through bureaucratic interference rather than direct confrontation that might generate unwanted attention or martyrdom narratives. They're implementing standard isolation protocols, she explains to her husband while reviewing the pattern of restrictions that have emerged over the previous week. Cut off your research access, eliminate funding streams, and isolate you from academic support networks. Classic soft containment procedures. Professor Hawthorne experiences similar pressure escalation at the University of Pennsylvania. His graduate research assistants receive sudden reassignments to other faculty members. His office computer access becomes temporarily unavailable due to system upgrades that never conclude. Most significantly, his decades of correspondence with international colleagues abruptly ceases as universities worldwide implement security reviews of archaeological communication protocols. The coordinated nature of these restrictions confirms what the researchers have suspected. They're not facing random academic politics, but systematic implementation of suppression protocols by institutions that understand the implications of their discoveries. Agent Morrison's operational parameters expand to include comprehensive academic intervention across multiple institutions. Her coordination responsibilities now involve universities in 14 countries where researchers have accessed materials related to Mesopotamian genetic modification programs. Each institution receives security guidance that necessitates immediate restriction of sensitive archaeological research pending national security review. The bureaucratic language obscures the reality of coordinated suppression designed to prevent paradigm-threatening research from reaching public awareness. Academic freedom becomes secondary to institutional preservation when discoveries threaten foundational assumptions that entire disciplines depend upon for legitimacy and funding. Morrison's surveillance reports document the researchers' growing understanding of their situation. Military training enables them to recognize information warfare tactics that civilian academics typically miss until their careers are already destroyed. Their analytical capabilities pose unique threats because they can identify operational patterns and implement countermeasures based on decades of experience with classified information security protocols. Dr. Ashford begins implementing operational security measures that reflect his military background. He creates multiple backup copies of research materials, stores them in geographically dispersed locations, and establishes communication protocols with trusted contacts who can serve as information repositories if primary research capabilities become compromised. "We're dealing with sophisticated opposition," he tells his wife while establishing encrypted communication channels with Professor Hawthorne. Standard academic approaches won't work against military-grade suppression operations. We need to think tactically about information preservation and dissemination. Colonel Ashford applies her intelligence training to develop contingency plans for various suppression scenarios. Her analysis suggests that their research has already triggered institutional responses that will escalate systematically until complete containment is achieved, or the researchers abandon their investigation. They'll target our credibility first, she explains, while reviewing psychological warfare manuals that describe standard procedures for discrediting inconvenient researchers. Professional reputation destruction, followed by financial pressure, then legal harassment if necessary. The objective is complete marginalization without creating martyrs. Professor Hawthorne's 43 years of experience with academic suppression provide valuable intelligence about institutional capabilities and limitations. His files document the systematic career destruction of dozens of researchers who approached similar conclusions, but also reveal patterns that suggest potential vulnerabilities in suppression protocols. They depend on institutional cooperation, Hawthorne observes during a secure conference call with the Ashfords. Universities, museums, and government agencies must coordinate to achieve complete information control. Disrupting that coordination could create opportunities for information dissemination. The researchers develop a strategy based on their combined military and academic experience. Rather than attempting direct confrontation with superior institutional resources, they plan to implement information warfare techniques designed to ensure their discoveries survive even if their careers do not. Agent Morrison's monitoring equipment detects the increased operational security measures employed by her targets. Encrypted communications, dispersed information storage, and coordinated countermeasures indicate that the researchers understand they're under active suppression and have begun implementing resistance protocols. Her operational briefing materials include escalation procedures for targets who demonstrate sophisticated understanding of information warfare tactics. Standard academic intervention may prove insufficient against researchers with military training in operational security and resistance techniques. Morrison requests authorization for enhanced countermeasures that extend beyond academic pressure to include financial investigation, legal harassment, and systematic disruption of personal relationships that provide emotional support for continued resistance to institutional authority. The authorization arrives within hours, confirming that senior levels of government and corporate leadership consider the researchers' discoveries sufficiently threatening to justify comprehensive suppression operations that exceed normal academic containment protocols. The escalation reflects the profound implications of the researchers' findings for established social control mechanisms. If human populations understood the genetic and linguistic programming that influences their behavior, the techniques would lose effectiveness that depends on operating below conscious awareness. The Ashfords and Professor Hawthorne have uncovered evidence that threatens to expose control systems that have operated successfully for millennia. Their military backgrounds provide analytical capabilities and resistance training that make them uniquely dangerous to institutional interests that depend on population compliance for continued authority. The confrontation represents more than academic disagreement. It constitutes information warfare between researchers seeking truth and institutions protecting carefully constructed narratives that maintain social stability through controlled ignorance of humanity's true origins and continuing genetic programming. The preservation operation begins at dawn on a Tuesday in October, when Professor Hawthorne arrives at his university office to find security personnel installing new equipment upgrades that will monitor all computer activity and restrict access to sensitive archaeological databases. He recognizes the installation as comprehensive surveillance rather than routine maintenance, the same techniques he'd observed during previous suppression operations targeting colleagues who'd approached uncomfortable conclusions. Instead of confronting the security team, Hawthorne implements contingency plans developed during 43 years of careful observation. Hidden storage locations throughout Philadelphia contain copies of his most sensitive research materials, including photographs and translations that exist in no official archaeological database. Personal relationships with trusted colleagues worldwide provide secure communication channels that bypass institutional monitoring systems. Dr. Ashford coordinates the information preservation effort from his converted garage laboratory, where military-grade communication equipment enables encrypted contact with researchers across 5 continents. His engineering background proves invaluable for developing secure storage and transmission protocols that can survive systematic institutional suppression attempts. We have approximately 72 hours before complete communications blackout, he informs his wife while reviewing surveillance patterns that indicate escalating operational pressure. After that, any attempt to disseminate our findings will face active countermeasures rather than passive bureaucratic interference. Colonel Ashford applies her intelligence training to develop multiple contingency scenarios for information dissemination under hostile conditions. Her analysis indicates that traditional academic channels are already compromised, requiring alternative approaches that bypass institutional control mechanisms entirely. Military veteran networks, she suggests, while reviewing distribution strategies. Independent researchers with security clearances who can recognize operational significance without requiring academic validation. People who understand institutional suppression and won't dismiss evidence based on source rather than content. The researchers have documented evidence that challenges fundamental assumptions about human development, genetic manipulation, and social control mechanisms that operate through embedded behavioral programming. Their discoveries threaten to expose control systems that have functioned successfully for millennia by remaining invisible to the populations they influence. Professor Hawthorne's files contain contact information for independent researchers worldwide who've approached similar conclusions through different analytical pathways. These individuals operate outside traditional academic institutions, making them less vulnerable to standard suppression protocols that depend on institutional cooperation. Agent Morrison's surveillance equipment detects the increased communication activity as the researchers implement information preservation protocols. Her operational briefing materials indicate that targets with military training often attempt final information dumps when facing imminent suppression, requiring immediate countermeasures to prevent data dissemination. Morrison coordinates with communication monitoring specialists to identify and intercept transmission attempts by the target researchers. Her authorization now includes disruption of internet services, telephone communications, and postal deliveries within specified geographical areas to prevent information leakage during the final suppression phase. The technological capabilities available to suppression operations reflect decades of development in information warfare techniques. Real-time monitoring of electronic communications enables immediate identification and neutralization of attempts to transmit sensitive materials beyond institutional control boundaries. Dr. Ashford recognizes the electronic surveillance through techniques learned during military communications security training. His countermeasures involve multiple redundant transmission methods, including dead drop locations, trusted human couriers, and pre-positioned information caches that can be activated by coded signals. They're monitoring electronic communications, he informs Professor Hawthorne during a face-to-face meeting in a location chosen for its poor surveillance coverage. We need to implement analog backup systems that don't depend on infrastructure they can control. The researchers develop a distribution strategy that combines traditional espionage techniques with modern information storage technology. Physical documents hidden in secure locations, human courier networks, and coded signals that can activate pre-positioned information releases provide multiple pathways for their discoveries to reach appropriate audiences. Colonel Ashford's intelligence background enables recognition of institutional vulnerabilities that could be exploited for information dissemination. Government agencies and academic institutions depend on compartmentalization that prevents complete information control when determined individuals implement sophisticated countermeasures. They can suppress individuals but not information itself, she explains, while reviewing operational plans. Our objective is ensuring the data survives even if we don't. Future researchers will be able to continue the investigation using materials we preserve and distribute. Professor Hawthorne implements the final phase of his 4-decade information preservation strategy. Trusted colleagues worldwide receive packages containing complete documentation of Sumerian genetic modification programs, archaeological suppression evidence, and institutional coordination mechanisms that maintain control through managed ignorance. The packages include detailed instructions for recognizing and countering suppression operations, enabling recipients to continue the research using security protocols developed through extensive experience with institutional resistance to paradigm-threatening discoveries. Agent Morrison's operational reports document the systematic implementation of information preservation protocols by her targets. The sophistication of their countermeasures indicates military-level operational security training that exceeds standard academic suppression capabilities. Her recommendations include immediate escalation to comprehensive suppression protocols that extend beyond academic pressure to include legal harassment, financial investigation, and systematic disruption of personal relationships that provide emotional support for continued resistance. The authorization for enhanced countermeasures arrives with unusual speed, confirming that senior government and corporate leadership consider the researchers' discoveries sufficiently threatening to justify suppression operations that exceed normal institutional containment procedures. The escalation reflects recognition that the Ashfords and Professor Hawthorne have uncovered evidence with implications that extend far beyond academic disagreement into territory that threatens fundamental assumptions about human autonomy and institutional authority upon which modern civilization depends for social stability. Their research documents genetic and linguistic programming that influences human behavior below conscious awareness, archaeological suppression that conceals humanity's true origins, and institutional coordination that maintains social control through carefully managed ignorance of uncomfortable truths about human development and continuing manipulation. The confrontation represents the intersection of information warfare and paradigm protection, where powerful institutions implement comprehensive suppression to prevent revelations that could destabilize control mechanisms that have operated successfully for millennia through invisibility and population compliance. 6 months later, Dr. Garrett Ashford stands in the morning light filtering through the windows of his converted garage laboratory, now stripped of research materials and surveillance equipment alike. The institutional suppression operation achieved its primary objectives, his university access terminated, research funding eliminated, and academic credentials systematically discredited through professional review processes that found significant methodological flaws in work that had been praised for years. Yet the information survived. Professor Hawthorne's international distribution network successfully transmitted complete documentation to independent researchers across 14 countries before communication blackouts could prevent dissemination. The materials reached military veterans, retired intelligence personnel, and private investigators who recognized operational patterns that civilian academics typically miss or dismiss. Agent Morrison's final operational report acknowledges partial success in containing institutional damage, while noting the impossibility of complete information suppression when targets possess military-level Operational security training. The research materials continue circulating among populations with sufficient analytical capabilities to understand their implications, creating ongoing security concerns that require permanent monitoring rather than one-time suppression. The clay tablets that started everything remain in their museum storage rooms, their cuneiform wedges still pressing ancient truths into consciousness, despite institutional efforts to maintain comfortable ignorance. Dr. Ashford's translations spread through veteran networks that understand information warfare and recognize suppression operations when they encounter them. Colonel Patricia Ashford reviews their situation with the strategic assessment skills developed during 23 years of military intelligence work. Their personal costs proved significant. Professional reputation, financial security, and social relationships all damaged by systematic institutional pressure designed to isolate and marginalize inconvenient researchers. "But we accomplished the mission," she tells her husband, while reviewing correspondence from contacts who received their documentation. "The information reached people who can understand its significance and continue the investigation using protocols we developed." The mission they defined themselves involved preserving evidence that challenges fundamental assumptions about human development, genetic manipulation, and social control mechanisms embedded in civilization itself. Their military background enabled recognition of operational patterns that academic training typically obscures through theoretical frameworks that transform literal evidence into metaphorical interpretation. Dr. Ashford opens his final research file, a summary document that synthesizes 4 years of investigation into conclusions that institutional authorities consider too dangerous for public awareness. The evidence documents genetic modification programs that shaped human development, linguistic control mechanisms that influence consciousness, and archaeological suppression that conceals humanity's true origins. The Sumerians weren't writing mythology, he states with the quiet certainty of an engineer who spent decades reading technical specifications. They were documenting administrative procedures for a genetic modification program that created modern humanity using systematic breeding protocols and behavioral programming. The implications extend far beyond academic disagreement into territory that threatens assumptions about human autonomy and institutional authority upon which modern civilization depends for stability. If human populations understood the genetic and linguistic programming that influences their behavior, control mechanisms that depend on invisibility would lose their effectiveness. Professor Hawthorne continues his research from a small apartment in Philadelphia, using materials preserved through 4 decades of careful preparation for institutional suppression. His correspondence with international colleagues creates an informal network of researchers who investigate sensitive archaeological evidence using security protocols developed through extensive experience with academic resistance. The pattern they've documented suggests that institutional suppression serves the same function as ancient priesthoods, determining which information receives official approval and which faces systematic elimination. Modern bureaucracy perpetuates control mechanisms established during post-flood reorganization when linguistic and genetic programming created behavioral compliance that operates below conscious awareness. Yet resistance persists among individuals whose genetic makeup includes variants that provide immunity to embedded programming. Military veterans, law enforcement personnel, and independent researchers demonstrate disproportionate representation in populations that question institutional narratives and seek evidence-based truth rather than consensus-approved interpretation. You've served your country with honor. You understand operational security, evidence analysis, and institutional resistance to uncomfortable conclusions. The research documented in these pages confirms what your experience already suggested, that powerful institutions implement sophisticated control mechanisms to maintain authority through managed ignorance rather than informed consent. The ancient tablets speak across millennia to warn that human autonomy requires constant vigilance against control systems that operate through invisibility and population compliance. The genetic modifications described in Sumerian texts created behavioral programming that influences contemporary human populations through neurological architecture optimized for institutional obedience rather than independent analysis. Dr. Ashford closes his final research file and prepares for whatever consequences institutional suppression may yet impose. His military training emphasized mission completion over personal comfort, and the mission they defined involved ensuring that critical information survived regardless of individual costs. The clay tablets remain in their museum vaults, their ancient warnings still visible to those with courage to read them literally rather than metaphorically. The genetic programming embedded in human populations continues influencing behavior through mechanisms that operate below conscious awareness. But knowledge of these systems provides the first step towards resistance. Time will tell whether the evidence preserved by the Ashfords and Professor Hawthorne reaches sufficient audiences to create paradigm shifts that challenge institutional control mechanisms. The same clay that recorded humanity's genetic modification now carries forward the means to recognize and resist continuing manipulation. Perhaps the ancient scribes understood that clay, once awakened to its own nature, remembers that it was never meant to remain forever silent. The breath of consciousness, whether imposed by gods or preserved by researchers, continues moving through institutions and assumptions that shape human civilization. In the gathering twilight outside Fort Bragg, the questions raised by ancient Mesopotamian clay continue echoing through time, waiting for answers that may determine whether humanity's future repeats its carefully managed past or finally discovers what genuine freedom might look like beyond the reach of control systems established in Sumerian times.